Shyness and social anxiety is universal, and everyone, except Chuck Norris, has experienced it from time to time. If you click this video, however, then social anxiety right now might be crippling your ability to build meaningful relationships, advance your career, and live your absolute best life. So in this video, I'm gonna explain how to finally conquer your social anxiety using what is considered one of the top treatment plans for social anxiety, exposure therapy. It's going to be a 4-step guide on how to create and carry out an effective exposure plan that you can start implementing literally today. But be sure to stick around until the end of the video, because I'm going to also cover the 5 most common mistakes people make when they practice exposure, which can lead to an ineffective treatment as well as sometimes increase fear. Before I get into the 4 steps, for those who don't know what exposure therapy is, or more specifically in vivo exposure, it's basically done by exposing yourself to situations that cause fear and anxiety, and doing this over and over again until eventually your anxiety and fear go down. It works by giving you the opportunity to test whether or not your anxious thoughts, assumptions, or interpretations are true or not, in which it usually ends up being untrue or overly exaggerated. And it has been scientifically proven to be a very effective treatment plan for social anxiety. Alright, so let's jump right into it. So how do you conduct exposure? There are 4 main steps that are involved in an effective exposure plan. 1, initial assessment. 2, planning appropriate practices. 3, carrying out the practices. And 4, maintaining improvements. Initial assessment. It's really important to have a good understanding of your social anxiety so that you can plan out the appropriate practices that you want to start exposing yourself to. This involves a 2-step process. Step 1 is to create a list of your feared social situations and rank them from 0 to 100. 0 being no fear at all, and 100 being very extreme, I'm gonna pee myself fear. Step 2 involves creating a list of the different kind of variables that can make your anxiety better or worse. For example, if you're afraid of having a conversation with someone, then their age, sex, physical attractiveness, or how well you know the other person has an effect on your anxiety. And then again, you want to rank these variables as well from 0 to 100, 0 being no effect at all and 100 being a very high effect. Step 2, planning appropriate practices. Planning practices involves the creation of an exposure hierarchy. You probably already know what a social hierarchy is, but for those who don't, it's basically a very specific list of all your very specific feared social situations. And these are ranked in order, with the bottom on the list being your least feared situations and the top being your most feared. Now, it's very critical that you're very specific with your list. And I've included an example of an exposure hierarchy in the description below so that you can see what I mean by that. Step 3, carrying out the practices. So after you've completed your hierarchy, the real fun begins. But no, on a serious note, this is actually the most important part of the step, where you start at the bottom or near the bottom of your list with practices that are somewhat outside your comfort zone, but that you can actually still do them. And then from there, you slowly work your way to the top. Now, it's really important to realize that exposure can actually end up increasing your fear level. So as I mentioned previously, I'm going to explain how to prevent that from happening near the end. Step 4, maintaining improvements. Congratulations! You have successfully conquered your social anxiety and can now complete situations at the top of your list with relative ease. Your fear and anxiety no longer hold you back in life. But now what? Well, it's absolutely imperative that you continue to maintain your improvements going forward with occasional practices. Avoiding to do this is actually one of the reasons a lot of people have their fear return even though they did exposure effectively. Now, you might be someone like Bob, who's tried exposure therapy in the past and failed miserably. Or you might be someone like Sally, who's been exposed to many scary situations through everyday life experiences, but still dreads the thought of being social at a party. In fact, your anxiety might have even gotten worse through exposure. As a result, you might be skeptical about exposure therapy ever working for you. And before you throw in the towel and call it quits, it's important to realize that exposure is not effective under all circumstances. In fact, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there are 5 common mistakes that people make when practicing exposure that sabotage their progress. The first mistake is that the exposure is unpredictable and uncontrolled. Unpredictable exposure can actually lead to an increase in fear, especially if there's a negative event or consequence that occurs. For example, if you're afraid of dogs and a dog who comes out running from behind a tree and starts growling at you, then your fear is probably going to get worse. However, if you were to intentionally and gradually expose yourself to your neighbor's friendly dog, then your fear would most likely decrease over time. So you need to make sure that your exposures are predictable and under your control. Mistake number 2, the exposure is brief in duration. This means that you get in a situation that's scary, you get anxious, and then you immediately leave. Now, it was good that you were able to put yourself in the scary situation in the first place. However, leaving immediately afterwards reinforces the belief in your mind that being in a situation that's scary is uncomfortable, and then leaving or escaping the situation gives you a sense of relief and comfort. Your mind thinks that leaving or escaping a situation, or even avoiding it, leads to the prevention of your feared negative consequences from occurring. By continuing to avoid or escape situations that make you feel uncomfortable, you don't give your mind the opportunity to realize that the situation is in fact very safe, and that the likelihood of your social catastrophes from occurring, such as being humiliated, criticized, or harshly rejected, are very low. It's the same thing as someone who thinks that avoiding planes has kept them safe from dying in a plane crash, even though the chances of them dying in a plane crash is close to zero, whether they fly or not. So you want to make sure that your practices are prolonged and that you stay in the situation for as long as possible, either until your anxiety comes down or that you learn that your feared negative consequences don't occur. A good rule of thumb is to increase the duration of your exposure by 10% each time. This incremental increase causes gradual progress without feeling overwhelmed. Mistake number 3, the exposure is infrequent. Think about it. Has any real progress ever come from doing things infrequently? Every time you do the exposure practice, it'll feel like starting over again. You waste your own time. You could have been at home making gingerbread cookies instead. Instead, the exposure should be frequent, especially at the start. So going and doing exposure twice a week is better than doing it once a week. Doing it 3 times a week is better than doing it twice a week, so on. Also, doing exposure 3 times a week for 1 hour is better than doing it 2 times a week for 2 hours. Mistake number 4, the exposure involves anxious thinking. Now, it's very common for the socially anxious individual to experience negative thoughts before, during, and especially after the exposure practice. Repetitive negative thoughts, such as people will probably notice my shaky hands, or people probably thought I was an idiot, will almost guarantee that exposure will not work for you. This is why it's so important to continuously challenge and counter your negative thoughts while doing exposure practices. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is a great way to do this, and you might have heard of CBT before, but I will cover it in detail in another video. But for now, I highly recommend to keep a journal, at least in the very beginning, where you can write down all of your anxious thoughts and then challenging points to counter each thought. Now, to help you do this, there are many forms and templates online that you can find simply by Googling CBT thought record or decatastrophizing form. I've also included some templates in the description down below for you to check out. And finally, mistake number 5 is that the exposure includes subtle avoidance strategies. Now, subtle avoidance strategies are strategies of avoidance that are subtle. No, but on a serious note, these are things that people sometimes do to ease the discomfort of a scary situation instead of completely avoiding it. These are split up into 5 main categories: distraction, overprotective behaviors, overcompensating for perceived deficits, excessive checking and reassurance seeking, and finally, substance abuse. So category 1, distraction. Now, as the name suggests, this involves distracting yourself from your anxious thoughts and feelings. For example, if you're at a party, you might keep yourself busy with some activity so that you remain distracted from your anxious thoughts that you might otherwise be experiencing. Overprotective behaviors. These involve small things that you might do to make yourself feel safer and more comfortable in situations that you fear. For example, if you're talking to an attractive girl, you might avoid eye contact, or if you're going to a party, you might always bring a friend with you so that you avoid having to talk to someone that you don't know. If you're someone who works way too hard to make sure your fearful predictions don't come true, then you're engaging in overcompensation for perceived deficits. An example of this is if you're afraid of social interactions with other people, then what you might do is work really hard and spend hours preparing topics of conversation and then rehearsing what you might say to them later on. Excessively checking and reassurance seeking. This involves excessively checking to see if you're perceived by others in a positive light. For example, excessively reading into other people's body language to see whether or not they like you or if they're mad at you or not. And finally, substance abuse. Drinking alcohol or using drugs actually ends up undermining the effects of exposure because it artificially lowers your fear and anxiety. For exposure to actually be effective, you need to experience some level of fear and also realize that your fear level will naturally go down without the help of drugs or alcohol. If you really want to drink or get high or snort cocaine, do it at least after your fear level has somewhat decreased so you can get the most benefit from exposure. So when you're doing your exposure practices, it's really important to gradually work towards eliminating these subtle avoidance strategies so that you could get the most benefit from exposure therapy. Now, as I mentioned before, it's absolutely crucial to always be challenging your negative thoughts and assumptions using CBT techniques. Because of how imperative this is, my next video is going to be covering the 5 most powerful CBT techniques that really help bring your anxiety down and ensure that your exposure practices are not wasted. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you can be alerted when that video comes out. If you guys want to learn more about everything I talked about in this video in depth, then make sure you check out the Shyness and Social Anxiety Workbook by Martin Anthony and Richard Swinson. The link is in the description down below. Thank you again for watching, and remember,